Thank you, and may I say I am very happy to be here too. Thank you for the invitation. This is a kind of gathering which I think is extremely important and which I very much like to connect with. I work in Australia a good deal with teachers. I have worked with schools and to some extent with youth workers, and I regard this as a crucial forum, connection, if you like, for the kind of research and intellectual work which I have been involved in. I am going to talk about research on masculinity, but also about some practical and political issues in the education of boys and young men. By education, I mean the term very broadly, not just schools, but also technical education, higher education, social work, community activity, the whole spectrum of circumstances in which young people grow up, become persons, and become active in the world. I need to stand more into the microphone. Okay. But one other preliminary thing. I have brought some show and tell. Two recent books, one of which will give the intellectual background to some of the things I will be saying from a global south perspective. And the other, a recently published book, published in fact just 2 weeks ago, called Confronting Equality, which has some of my recent research writing about gender in it. So I'll pass these around for you to see, and I would be quite grateful to have them back at the end of the session. Lovely. And please visit my website. This is a new website, and I'm very proud of it. I had a lot of help from young people in making it, but you'll find there some connections to my research on questions about gender and masculinity. I want to start by talking a little bit about the history of education. There is now a kind of popular view in many parts of the world that education is basically women's business. Most teachers in countries like Australia are women, and there is, in some public discourse about boys, a belief that schools are feminized institutions and have a feminizing influence on boys. Am I right? Is this kind of discourse present in Austria too? It's certainly there in Australia. And it's well worth remembering when we hear that kind of discourse that schools as institutions were invented by men for boys. That's where historically the institution of the school came from. It was a segregated institution. The curriculum of the early modern school was intended to form certain kinds of men, and the universities in the early, the first few hundred years of their existence were also institutions for men with a curriculum designed to form certain kinds of men's capacities. This was eventually challenged. One of the important challenges is a person well known in this part of this region of the world, Komensky, known in the English-speaking world as Comenius, great educational reformer, who conceived the idea of a comprehensive popular education. And in the fullness of time, 200 or 300 years after Comenius lived, this vision was actually turned into reality with the mass school system created in the much of Europe and in the rich colonial areas like Australia in the 19th century, at which point literacy became a mass reality, and large proportions of the population of young people spend at least part of their time in formal education. But the institution that was created on a mass scale at that time by race in places like Australia, and very, very frequently segregated by gender. So this is a school about 5 kilometres from my home in central Sydney. It was built in the 19th century as part of this creation of a mass education system, including working class children. But it was built with classes for boys at one end and classes for girls at the other end. And as you can see, the gender division was literally set in stone as part of the architectural design of the education system. So when I went to school, when I was in primary school in the 1950s, in another part of the city, a new part of the city, there was still a boys' end of the school and a girls' end of the school. And when I went to gymnasium, there was a girls' high school and a boys' high school in the region. So mass education was born segregated, and that kind of segregation persists even in times when most schools in Australia now are co-educational. There remain curriculum pathways which are principally for girls or principally for boys, and in technical education, which is not at the centre of much academic discussion, but is very important as the venue for much working class education for youth. Technical education too is still largely de facto gender segregated in my country, and I think in most others. So there is a long history in educational institutions of gender division being taken for granted, just assumed that it is somehow natural and appropriate for there to be a boys' end of the school and a girls' end of the school. But that taken for grantedness of gender began to be challenged in a serious way 30 or 40 years ago by the women's liberation movement, which, as one of its earliest political agendas, began examining the impact of segregated or de facto segregated education on the lives of girls. Australia was in fact one of the pioneers in this area. We don't only have kangaroos in the streets, we also have education radicals and a strong feminist movement in Australia, contrary to common belief. And this document, Girls' School and Society, which came out in 1975, is, I believe, the first national level gender equity policy for a school system anywhere in the world. And it precisely challenged the taken for grantedness of a female role and a male role, limited expectations for girls, different expectations for boys. It really triggered a very big debate in Australia about gender and education, and led to 20 or 30 years of experiment and innovation led by feminist women, which was largely addressing the educational needs of girls So the policy document was called Girls, School and Society. And it was in that generation of policy making largely assumed that the problem of gender was a problem about the situation of girls, that girls were the subject of gender reform policy. Now, there was some discussion of boys at that in the decade after that. The first Australian report about the education of boys came out in 1985, but it did not attract very much attention. And most of the actual programs that were set up were, for instance, programs to improve girls' competence and confidence in dealing with mathematics or technical subjects, bringing girls into science and technology. And that was unfortunate because it opened the door, so to speak, to a backlash, which in Australia did occur in the 1990s and in the early 2000s. There was a very popular discourse that developed which presented boys as the new oppressed group, which claimed that boys were in crisis, masculinity was in crisis, men did not know where to go with their lives, and something had to be done to solve the problems of boys and men. This discourse spread into many areas. It spread into social work, it spread in a big way into education, it spread into popular psychology, it spread into health and took their commercial forms, such as the growth of a men's health discourse and indeed a small industry. You will notice, I'm sure, that this is not in English, not even in German, although I have bought this magazine on a railway station in Germany, but I actually got this copy in Santiago de Chile. And it is, of course, in Spanish. So there is a global circulation of a certain discourse about the problems of men and boys and the need to, in this case, provide commercial solutions to the problems of men and boys. And particularly influential in this growing discourse about boys and men in crisis was a genre of pop psychology, the kind of anecdotal psychology which tried to persuade us that men are from Mars and women are from Venus, that men need to contact the hairy inner truth of deep masculinity. You remember this stuff? I'm sure you had it here in various forms. And that became immensely popular. That book, Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus, has sold 30 million copies around the world. It's one of the all-time bestsellers in the world, that book. And it is packed with lies. I mean, it is fundamentally false as a representation of the truth about psychology, as we know. So there is a kind of industry has developed which is concerned with restoring gender division against the challenges to the taken for grantedness of gender. There is a kind of industry about restoring true divisions between men and women, and as part of that, an important part of that, restoring true masculinity in the lives of boys and men. And this has an influence. This has had an influence on government policy in Australia. We had, for 10 years, a right-wing government which believed these kinds of stories and put about, I think the total was about $30 million into educational programs based on these kinds of ideas targeted to boys. There was an evaluation of these programs after a couple of years which told us that they had almost no effect because they were based on bad educational reasoning, but they still attracted a lot of support. So these, although the intellectual basis of the boys in crisis discourse is lacking, is absent, nevertheless this has a powerful social impact. Fortunately, at the same time as these discourses developed, we also began to get increasing actual research on questions of gender division and masculinities. And I want to remind you briefly of some of the important conclusions of the research on gender and particularly on masculinities that have been assembled over the last 20 or 25 years. The first of these, and maybe the most important for educators to know, is that there is a great deal of psychological evidence about differences between boys and girls, men and women. There's a large volume, there are thousands of psychological research studies. The field is known as sex difference research, which have looked for psychological differences in emotion, in intellectual skills, patterns of learning, and so on and so forth between boys and girls. And the overwhelming finding of this very large body of knowledge is that the differences between groups, between men and women as groups, boys and girls as groups, are very, very small. There are very few clear psychological differences between boys as a group and girls as a group. And this is very thoroughly documented. This is very thoroughly known. This is in fact one of the most powerfully proven conclusions in the whole discipline of psychology. So one of the leading figures, psychologists in this field, a US psychologist who published a review of all of this research involving millions of respondents, published a review of this just a few years ago, suggested we should rename the field of research. It's not sex difference research. It should really be renamed sex similarity research. And that's particularly important for us to know because popular psychology has persuaded many people that the brain differences between boys and girls are so great that we need different pedagogy for boys. The boys need to run around a lot, they have short attention span, they need top-down pedagogy, strong framing of curriculum, remember all of this kind of stuff? And to my mind, those claims are basically an insult to boys. Boys are much more diverse. Boys don't have just one learning strategy. Like girls, boys have multiple learning strategies, and they are able to shift between learning strategies in different learning circumstances, as most teachers know in practice, even though people are telling them that there are these great psychological gulfs between boys and girls. So we should be confident about the science here. The science tells us that boys and girls' psychological characteristics are broadly similar, or the same range of difference appears among both boys and girls. The differences between boys and girls, between men and women, are not in their fundamental psychological makeup. They are in their reproductive biology and in the social situation that we place them in, the social situations that we construct, our institutions construct for boys and men. Okay, that is the topic, that is the field in which most of the recent social research on masculinities is focused. That is, we have, in studying the diversity of masculinities, we have looked at the level of social practices that are often created in the context of institutions. And when we look at patterns of social practice, we do find multiple constructions of masculinity. We find in different milieux, or sometimes within the same milieu, different ways of being a man, different ideas of what it is proper for a man to be and do. So I want to refer here to some research from Latin America, where I might say much of the most interesting research on masculinities has been done. There's a very active research network on questions of masculinity in Latin America. This is one of the researchers, Norma Fuller from Peru, who conducted quite an innovative survey study some years ago, looking at constructions of masculinity in different social classes and in different regions of the country, the big city, the rural centre, the countryside and the regional centre, and was able to document the different understandings and practices of masculinity that could be found in those different settings. And this is a very common finding in research on masculinity from different countries in the world, that when you go looking for patterns of masculinity, you usually find a plurality of patterns of masculinity, ways of being a man. So what the popular psychology of masculinity was identifying as the one true masculinity, the male role, so to speak, is usually only the hegemonic version of masculinity in a given social setting, which may not be the reality of the practice of gender for large numbers of men. As boys grow up, they encounter institutions which in various ways construct masculinity for them, which tell them what it is appropriate for them to do, what they should desire, and how they should present themselves. Perhaps the most important institution is, of course, the family, which is not a static institution. It's an institution that changes itself. But one of the key things about the family as a site for learning about gender is that there are usually both men and women in it. And this is worth remembering from a kind of psychodynamic point of view, because some of the popular discourse about masculinity imagines masculinity as a kind of fluid that is passed down from men to boys and only from men to boys. So in that kind of imagination, it's thought that what boys need in order to learn masculinity is male role models. You can't get masculinity any other way. When people do close focus research with individual lives, individual life histories, I've done some of this myself, and I read other research of this kind with great interest, it becomes clear that patterns of gender, masculinities and femininities also, are formed in relation not to a single kind of role model, but to a range of practices of gender among adults, so that boys learn masculinity from women as well as from men, from mothers as well as from fathers, from sisters as well as from brothers. The enactment of gender, the learning of gender, is a reasonably complex process that involves a range of inputs, and we should not get, I think, stuck on the single idea of male role models as the key to learning of masculinities. Learning from men is certainly part of the picture, but it's not necessarily the be-all and end-all of the process. And of course, as boys grow up, they encounter institutions beyond the family, such as the media, mediated sport, and the like. This is one of my favourite teaching tools, this particular image. It's from the front page of the most popular newspaper in Sydney, and it reports a particular moment in the history of the most popular sport in Sydney, that is a particularly brutal form of football called rugby league. I, as part of my research task, as a gender researcher, read the sports pages regularly in the Sydney newspapers, and I'm fascinated by the way rugby league is reported. On the one side of the page is the list of the results of the matches for the previous weekend. On the other side is the list of injuries. So this is the test of men. Test, it's a joke, because test in Australia is the word for an international match, an international sporting match. So Australia versus England, Australia versus France, or whatever, is a test match. But it is also, the challenge, the measure of men is their prowess in this contest of bodies, force and skill on the football field. And that's this kind of construction of an aggressive, physically forceful masculinity is a very present reality in the lives of boys. All boys encounter this institution, because all of them are engaged in physical education, sport in schools. All of them confront this kind of construction of masculinity in the mass media. But then they have to develop a relationship to it. They have to negotiate whether they're going to try to be part of it, whether they're going to look on, whether they're going to oppose it, and so forth. The media don't simply control the minds of children and youth. They provide templates, they provide images, they attempt to stimulate desire. But young people are active in the matter too. And I'm sure those of you who work with boys or with girls will recognise this in your own practice. The activity, the agency, the negotiating power of young people is always present in these relationships. There is no mechanical transmission of a social model into the minds of young people. It's a much more active learning process than that. So that issue of what sociologists call agency, the power of both individuals and social groups to construct, to negotiate their relationship with structures, to construct paths of life, paths through history. That is extremely important, because the consequence of that is that gender patterns do change historically. And the issues that we face today are not necessarily the same issues that were faced 30 years ago or a lot further back than that. And there is again research evidence of this. I want to recall one piece of research which I'm sure will be familiar to many of you, a survey, national survey that was done in Germany a few years back, about 10 or 12 years ago, by Zulena and Foltz, which looked at the construction, the gender attitudes of a sample, cross-sectional sample of German men. And this is a very interesting graph. It classifies the attitudes to gender, what they call gender roles, of the men into 4 groups, and the one I want you to look at is the bottom one, the blue coloured graph, which is the percentage of men at each age who hold the most traditional view of the proper relationship between women and men, in domestic labour, who should earn the money, and so forth. And in this graph, the responses are classified by the age of the man who gave the particular response. So if you look over to the left, in the oldest age group, almost half give the most traditional response about gender roles. But as you come down below the age of 50, the proportion giving that most traditional response falls dramatically. So there is a very marked generational difference in assent to a conservative, very conservative position about gender roles in a national survey. And those of you who deal with quantitative research findings will recognise that that is a very strong result. You don't usually find such strong differences in mass attitude surveys. So that's a powerful demonstration of a generational difference in assumptions about gender equality. And I might say that similar trends, perhaps not quite as dramatic as that, are found in survey research in many other countries, United States, Australia, Japan, at least. So gender patterns, gender attitudes, gender practices do change historically, and that's a good thing to know. I mean, sometimes the change is away from gender equality. There are moments in history where things get worse. But that is, if you like, a basis of our educational optimism. Things can change, and therefore boys' work, boys' education, young men's education can have an impact over time. I want to turn now to some questions about global issues. In the research about masculinities that circulates in the English-speaking world, most of the debate, most of the research comes from the global north. It's done in Europe, it's done in North America, or in the richest countries of the periphery, such as Australia. But as I mentioned in referring to the Latin American research, there is also a debate about men and masculinity, research and social action about these issues in the majority world, in the global south, in the periphery. In India, for instance, one of the leading public intellectuals in India, Ashish Nandy, published a fascinating book called The Intimate Enemy, quite some time ago, 25 years ago, which talked about the construction of masculinities in the historical experience of colonialism in India, and argued powerfully that colonialism had reshaped masculinities both among the colonised and among the colonisers. So this fed back into the metropole. The largest, the most sustained program of research on men and masculinities that I know anywhere in the world has actually come from Chile, in the south of Latin America. The work principally of a researcher called José Olavarría, who's published a series of books, unfortunately none of them translated into English, though they are available for those of you who read Spanish, which has looked at a wide range of issues, ranging from issues of violence, economic change, boys' work, youth, and the problems of growing up and fatherhood, a fascinating body of research. And in Africa, there is also an active practical debate and a growing body of research about masculinities. This is one of the books that collects material from Africa. I think it's one of the very best collections of research, perhaps even the best collection of masculinity research I've seen from any part of the world at all. And in the imagery of the cover, again, you can see the sense of diversity and change, which has been an important, of course, a powerful experience in Southern Africa in recent years. But then, it's not only a question of masculinities existing in different regions of the world and having their own traditions of research and debate. We're also in a globalizing world. The old empires have gone, but we now have a global economy, a neoliberal regime internationally. We have new power figures, i.e. the transnational businessmen who run the most powerful institutions of our day, the transnational corporations. I've become involved in research with businessmen looking at the construction of masculinity in international business. I think that's one of the real frontiers of research now. This is another image that I like for my teaching because it conveys something of the attitude of businessmen internationally, that it's they actually who hold up the world, they who keep the wealth growing and the economy functioning. Pity about those workers down there who actually are labouring in the factories. The point that I want to make is that 98% of the top managers of transnational corporations are men. There are practically no women in that occupational world. So the construction of masculinity in transnational business in circumstances of often high pressure, high stakes negotiation is a fascinating issue. And how the masculinities of the controllers of the global economy relate to the local masculinities that we're familiar with is a difficult but really quite important issue, given the power of these people in the world economy. I've mentioned the word neoliberal as the dominant political outlook of this globalized world that we're in. Neoliberalism is a term that refers to a political agenda to let the markets rule, to make markets the main decision-making institutions in contemporary societies. And that has happened on a world scale in the form of economic restructuring, the structural adjustment programs of the 1980s and 90s, and the continuing restructuring of which we now see a particular version happening in Europe in the wake of the global financial crisis and the contemporary crisis of the Eurozone. Now that restructuring has led to the shifting of industrial production from one part of the world to another. It's produced rust belts in the old industrial areas of Germany, Britain, United States, and indeed Australia. It's led to massive migration within countries such as India, the growth of those mega cities in the third world on a scale beyond any urban experience before, where you get cities like Mexico, Sao Paulo, Calcutta, Mumbai, Shanghai and so forth, which have something like 20 million or 30 million people in them, almost unimaginable until very recently. So as part of that restructuring and population shift, you get massive populations of unemployed, underemployed or hardly employed people, often from the countryside, sometimes from urban working class backgrounds. And this becomes an important site for a rethinking of gender relations. There is, for instance, some very interesting Indian discussion of this. Some of it you can find if you can find, and I'm not sure if you can get this on the internet or not, but there's an Indian filmmaker, very interesting Indian filmmaker called Rahul Roy, R-O-Y, who's made films about this kind of experience, the experience of Indian men caught up in a situation where they are now no longer able to perform a breadwinner kind of role to guarantee the economic survival of their family without the economic participation of women, who can often get a job in the new sort of precarious economy more readily than the men. So there's a powerful process of renegotiation and change. It's sometimes a site of violence, sometimes a site of new forms of cooperation and renegotiation of family forms and the meaning of masculinities that's happening in those kinds of circumstances. And I suspect, though I don't know the research, that the kind of migration experience that has happened in Europe in a situation where there have been rising levels of structural unemployment and precarious livelihood in this continent too, have also produced complex and contradictory situations in migrant communities, which are also leading to renegotiations of gender, often quite difficult ones. So we're in a world of global change, of very complex but very insistent changing circumstances. And in those changing circumstances, we do fairly constantly have to rethink the educational project of bringing up boys. So I now want to finish what I'm going to say with some reflections on how to rethink boys' education in the kind of world that I've been talking about. The first question is, should we be panicking? Are things so dire out there that we really need to go into panic mode in thinking about the education of boys? And there is some discourse about the crisis of masculinity for boys, which suggests we should, which pictures boys as alienated from schools, as failing in schools as feminized institutions which simply don't suit the learning styles of boys. I think the answer to this question is fairly clear. There is no need for a general panic about boys. The major indicators of whether young people are in a serious way alienated from education would be attendance at schools and academic performance, formal measures of learning. And on both of those measures, boys and girls in most countries are fairly similar. And where there is a gender gap, it's usually in developing countries and to the advantage of boys, not the disadvantage of boys. So that historically, of course, women globally have had less access to education, and it's still the case that 2/3 of the world's illiterate people are women and girls. But in contemporary schooling, the attendance and academic performance figures do not suggest a general educational crisis for boys. But a finer look at the figures shows that there are some groups of boys who are in educational trouble. There are some groups of boys, often in situations of social dislocation, recent migrant communities, working class and poor parts of the working class, and indigenous communities in the world of settler colonialism. Boys from these groups often are, many of them, struggling to form productive relationships with a formal education system which was not designed for them, which was designed for other groups of boys, and is not functioning well for those particular groups of boys. So, for instance, in my home state of New South Wales in Australia, if you look at the figures for children who have been severely disciplined by the school to the point where they have been expelled from school. We don't hit them, we don't cane them as we used to do now, but if they've been are regarded by the school as a major discipline problem, they can be expelled. And the most recent figures show that 80% of the children expelled from schools in New South Wales are boys. So for a ratio of 4 to 1, boys to girls, in serious disciplinary trouble with the schools. And there's a similar ratio if you look at sort of measures of trauma, such as road injuries, being injured riding a bicycle or a motorbike, or stealing a car and smashing it. Again, something like 4 to 1, boys to girls in those circumstances. And when we're looking at interpersonal violence, of course, girls are more subject to sexual abuse and rape. But in terms of interpersonal violence, such as fighting and physical bullying in the school playground, it's principally boys who are the victims of those social practices. So there are specific groups of boys for whom the relationship with formal education is not working well, and about whom we really do need serious interventions and good policies. On a wider scale also, I, as a former professor of education, do have a concern about the curriculum of learning that boys as a group undertake, especially at the secondary level and post-secondary level, where it becomes possible for children to make choices between different subject areas. And it turns out when you look at the subject choices that young people are making in secondary and advanced education, there is still strong gender stereotyping. So in mathematics courses, for instance, in New South Wales high schools, there are far too few girls. In engineering-related courses and in technical education in engineering-related fields, that's overwhelmingly boys and very few young women. On the other hand, when you look at drama and areas of vocational education related to young children, there are far too few boys and young men. There is a kind of gender segregation, apparently voluntary, as young people and their families choose educational pathways. And what concerns me is the net effect of all of these choices of pathways on the global education of boys and young men as a group, because it means that part of the curriculum is missing. And specifically, it's the part of the curriculum that's concerned with human relationships and the humanities is often missing from the post-compulsory education of boys and young men. And that seems to me a real educational problem. It's the same kind of problem that was identified by feminist educators 30 years ago as part of the curriculum missing in the education of girls, that is the technical and scientific part. But this is, I think, a real educational problem which we are so far not succeeding in addressing. When I think about boys' educational needs, I want to argue that we should be thinking about boys' needs in a strongly educational way. And when we do this, I would argue boys' educational needs are frankly not very different from girls. Boys, like girls, need, above all, good schooling, well-functioning schools, professional and committed teachers. They need broad knowledge of the world. They need a comprehensive curriculum, and that includes an understanding of the social world, which, if they don't understand it, will come to bite them in the form of the global financial crisis or the next recession. And they need a diverse offering of education, not a narrow stereotyped track. And in those respects, their educational needs are very much like those of girls. One other thing that boys need, and often miss out because of the way that the educational institutions are organised, is opportunities to study gender issues. This is an example of a curriculum, a program for gender learning on the part of boys that was developed by some school teachers in Australia some years back, who were concerned about the difficulty that boys found in discussing gender issues in circumstances where they were subject to ridicule or had to take public positions that might be unpopular and so forth. So they devised a program of work. This is designed for middle high school, around about age 14, 15. It's one of many such programs that have been developed. I like this one because it was devised by teachers rather than a priori by academics. And it provided boys a safe space for discussing family relationships, sexuality, relationships with girls, and emotionality, questions of emotionality. And what this program found, what other programs of this kind have found, is that when you do provide the educational opportunity for boys, there's actually a high level of interest in questions about emotion, personal relationships, family relationships, and so forth among boys. Boys must want to learn about these issues. And this is what educators value. Pupil interest. It's one of the big predictors of good educational outcomes. And there's a high level of interest in these issues among boys, provided an appropriate setting and curriculum can be provided for. And that is the task of the adults involved in the institutions. So I'm going to end up with a few slogans. 3 principles for intelligent action in the education of boys and young men. Principle 1, think educationally. Okay?
Thank you.
Boys and young men are active learners. They're not passive, they're not stereotyped, they don't have only one learning style. They're active and multiple learners. They have multiple learning styles, many different ways of learning. And the educational task is to provide diverse opportunities for boys learning. And most boys, and some boys are undoubtedly, like some girls, badly harmed by bad social circumstances, by abuse, by bullying, by poverty. This is true and needs to be dealt with. But apart from that, most boys are resilient. Most boys are active learners and resilient, can cope with difficulty, can cope with setbacks, can cope with failure, and come back for further learning. And that's important for educators to do. So that's my first principle. Think education about boys. My second principle, think relationally about gender. Gender is not just about one box here with men and boys in it, one box there with women and boys in it. Gender is about a complex structure of relationships, negotiations, practices, historical changes. So we need to think in the education of boys about the relationships between masculinities, about the different constructions of masculinity that will exist in group boys, in different groups of boys. We need to recognise that, and the tension and the opportunities that those differences open. And we need to think also about the relationships of boys with girls and boys with women. As I've said before, women are important actors in the construction of masculinity among boys. So we need to think also constructively and proactively about that relationship. And finally, my third principle is think social justice. Don't think just about inclusion or exclusion of some minority. That has to start with thinking, but think about social justice on the whole societal scale. Our task is to make comprehensive institutions, the public education system, the whole school system, the state, the whole welfare service. Our task is to make those broad institutions work well for all groups of boarders. That's what social justice in education is about. Now, schools do work well now for some groups of boarders. There's no doubt about that. Some groups of boarders do extremely well in education, in schools, in universities. Most of them come from privileged social backgrounds, of course, as you know. And our task of reform is to get something like that same level of success with the other groups of boarders in society. That's what I mean by social justice. And if we can move in that direction, we can, I think, gradually begin to put behind us some of the fluff, some of the rhetoric with which we've been afflicted in the last generation, and move into both more practical and I think ultimately more hopeful ways of educating boys and more men. That's my hope.